Okay, so it's a solid amount of time before Yoshua around. Now we had this time period of Yoshua being like the leader of the Jewish people, and that lasted. He died at the age of 110. He entered at the age of probably like 60, 70 some years old. Okay, so he led the Jews in Israel for a solid 50 years. So it took about 30 years to conquest all of it properly. So a lot of the time that he spent was pretty restful towards the end of his life. And he was there to judge and make sure that law ran the country. Now, when he passed away, and after like his generation passed away, there was a time period called the Shoftim, where basically what happened was everyone went downhill. It says there was no king. It's a famous passage quoted over and over again in the book after Yoshua, which is called Shoftim. And the problem was
Shoftim of prophets.
Judges. So the side of those that the Jews did bad, okay, they got enslaved or they had to be punished. They were punished. They had a vassal king over them. They were attacked and pestered by the different neighbors. And then we cried out to God. God sent a savior in the way of a shofet, a judge, who was it's a very beautiful way to learn it, but most of them were military as well as leadership, like actual judges. They would judge people, but at the same time they could win the military wars. There was some who weren't. There was one person's job was the military victory, and the other was to actually judge the nation. And of them, there was even a female judge, Devorah. It's interesting because her victory was basically the victory that was the completion of the exiting of Egypt, which happened about 1,000 years before. So there was the entire completion came out under Devorah. And so the time period carries on, and then we enter into Samson, who's known as the last shofet judge in the book of prophets. Of judges, sorry. And Samson judged the nation for 20 years. And then he gets killed while killing all the Philistines. Now there's a small gap in between him and the next one. It's basically you turn on the page into the new book, which is called Sefer Shmuel. Okay, Shmuel and Shmuel Bet. Okay, and within there, that's when the Jews start like getting a bit shifty and saying we actually want a king of ourselves. So in the beginning part, we had still a Kohen who was leading us, named Eli, and then he kind of imbued Shmuel the prophet. To be the next leader. And Shmuel was after the nation, and they complained and said, we want to be like other nations. Give us a king. So eventually, Shmuel said, fine, we'll give you a king. And that's how they picked King Saul. Shaul HaMelech, the first king. Saul did some sketchy stuff and lost his kingship, and it got handed over to David. And that's when the whole Davidic dynasty started. Okay? So David had Shlomo, his son, and within David and Shlomo's time period is a majority of the other Megillot written. So you have Shir Hashirim, Kohelet, Eicha is later on. Root Eicha. Is there? I'm missing? Missing one? No, I'm missing it. Sorry. So two of them were written in that time period. And between David and Shlomo, they wrote Tehillim and Mishlei, Proverbs. Okay? That was the two of the masters. David focused on Tehillim, Shmuel focused on Mishlei. Mishlei is all about beautiful teachings and like morals and life ethics.
Sorry, did Shlomo not do Shir Hashirim?
Yes, he did do Shir Hashirim, but at the same time, it was all based off that they kind of like David started the work and it kind of led into Shlomo's lifetime.
Shlomo wrote a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
It was a real poet.
Yeah.
The ones that stayed with us were a few of them, and it's interesting because as he gets older, so they become more melancholy. They become more like upsetting. And Eicha was the last one that he wrote, which is all around. He wrote.
He wrote.
And so he wrote Kohelet.
Yes.
Kohelet's all about Hevel Havali, right? It's all just fleeting stuff. There's no. And his first one was Shir Hashirim, which is all about love and passion and relationships and connections. And as he gets older, so he becomes theoretically more disillusioned, or he just becomes more realistic
Or depressed.
And you can actually see this during his lifetime, which is really interesting. He wrote a lot of stuff, not just these books, but a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it gives the list in Sefer Shmuel. It's 3,000 proverbs, 1,500 songs, something like that. That's a lot. Very prolific writer, yeah. And at the same time, he also expanded Israel incredibly. He times about 20 times basically. He took Israel from being a tiny nation, and he got the entire Sinai Peninsula basically, all the way up to the Tigris River. Euphrates River at the top as well. So modern day Babylon, Iraq, Iran, that area. Israel was massive under Shlomo Melech, and he built the Beit HaMikdash. So this is the start of the first temple, and basically Shlomo Melech passes away, and he has a son called Rechavam, and then there's a challenger who was even in his lifetime called Yerovam. He exiled Yerovam to Egypt, and Yerovam became quite a force. And then Yerovam came back after Shlomo died and said, look, the taxes are high, we're not living happy lives, let's revolt. So a whole bunch of people followed Yerovam. Rehoboam messed up, and that's how you basically end up with two separate kingdoms in time. There was Israel and Yehuda. Yehuda in the south, Israel in the north. And it kind of created an entire split within the nation, where people in Israel couldn't cross over the border to Yehuda. And the middle point was the Beit HaMikdash. But the kings wouldn't allow the people of Israel to pass into Yehuda, because in Israel they didn't believe in a god. They believed in multiple gods. So they had multiple temples. There was Dan and Beersheba, the two main ones, where they had two golden calves, one in each. And that was the new Beit HaMikdash. It's back there. It was like a proper full-on its own entity, its own nation. Okay? Yeah. And there was a prophet who got up, doesn't even give his name, but he got up when he went into Israel, and he stood on the altar on the mizbech of Beersheba, of Dan, sorry, and he gave a nevuah. He said one day there will be a king called Yoash who will come here and he'll destroy this thing, and the sun will be that this will split open, and the ashes of the korbanot will come out of it, and he'll destroy all idols and cleanse the land. So a few kings go over. We have Elijah and Elisha, the prophets, both who performed amazing miracles. They were the real moral compasses of the Jews during that time period, because the kings were the most moral out. A lot of robbery, a lot of corruption, a lot of idol worship, adultery, and everything they could have gone on did go wrong with this. And that was the whole issue. Now we start moving towards later time periods of the kings, where we see the rising of the bigger, more like Sinai Peninsula, Mediterranean empires that start coming up. So you've got Persia, you've got Medes, you've got Assyria. They all start becoming a lot stronger. And eventually Assyria comes in under King Sanherib, and they kill and murder and pillage the whole of Israel, and they exile the 10 tribes. They take them all out of Israel, and they send them all over the world. And they were about to attack the Beit HaMikdash, they were about to conquer Yehuda, and a massive miracle occurred, and we were saved. That's under in Chizkiyahu's time, King Chizkiyahu. Yeshayahu basically doubled them on behalf of Chizkiyahu, and in one night, 180,000 Assyrian soldiers were killed by a malach, by an angel. Very, very amazing story. But Yerushalayim would have fallen if it weren't for that. Now, there's a very interesting book I'm reading currently called Jerusalem, written by a guy called Simon Sebag Montefiore, of like the original Montefiores, and his thing is Jerusalem. And he speaks about like how these kings would come in and raid the Beit HaMikdash because there was so much gold and so much silver that was still left from Shlomo Melech's times that you could just keep on raiding it and there'll still be more that come out. And eventually it just became so difficult to keep a nation together there because it was constantly being attacked, because it was like the epicenter. And that explains why Yerushalayim is such a contentious place nowadays, because everyone would go there for the riches and the gold, but at the same time feel this amazing connection to God. And it kind of created this whole melting pot of different cultures within one city. And that's how we had modern Jerusalem, all the different cultures and that kind of stuff.
How long was the first Beit HaMikdash? How long that lasted?
420 years, something like that.
And they got into exile for 70 years.
Yeah. So we moved to seconds. So then what happened was basically we started getting worse and worse and worse. The kings got worse. They started like openly serving Avodah Zarah, and that was basically the end of it.
So we made the time of Shlomo HaMelech, there was complete peace. That was the most stable empire ever. There were no wars waged. Whatever Shlomo literally
the only wars was one he waged.
He waged wars, but and he literally he went to Lebanon. He went to Egypt and he got all these stories about like the doors that were made for the Beit HaMikdash that were made of. So firstly he had the cedars, these massive trees that were cut down and brought down.
Yeah, the fleets called the Ophir fleet. They used to bring in his trees and his gold.
Every single day. I tell you why I'm asking, because the first Beit HaMikdash, they were saying 73 years lasted before we lost it.
Okay.
Second Beit HaMikdash was close to just over 80 years, I think. It was 83 or it was 78, one of the two. The reason I'm saying it in Israel today, 78. And
Very interesting.
they're threatening that splitting the people right now.
So,
It's not as bad as the second Beit HaMikdash where they burned their own food and
yeah,
but it's like the timing is always sitting on 8 years.
yeah.
And it's that's why I asked you about 400. So I don't know.
So it was 420 years for the first Beit HaMikdash, around plus minus 412, that is right, give or take. And then we were in exile for 70 years, and we came back and rebuilt it.
Israel's second.
Yeah, so we'll get to that now. So during that time, toward the end of the first temple period, there were two major prophets known as Yirmiyahu and Yechezkel. Yirmiyahu lived primarily in the time of that destruction. He was imprisoned in the jail of the Beit HaMikdash itself, and he got freed. He would have been killed in the Beit HaMikdash, they hadn't freed him. Because he gave a nevuah to the king, saying, "You're going to get exiled, you're going to be killed, your 10 sons will be killed in front of you." And they were. He was made to watch, and afterwards he got his eyes gouged out, the king. And he, Yirmiyahu, wrote prolifically. His book is one of the most gut-wrenching books to read of nevuah. Like the prophecy you read in it, it's terrible. And then you get Yechezkel, who was literally himself, but also got exiled. As in the leaders of the Jews weren't killed. They were sent into Babylon, because you can't have a nation living in your nation if you're not going to swallow them up properly. But they didn't intend on taking them properly. They just wanted them out of Israel, out of their safety. So they took away them the big prophets, and that's what we know the story of Purim as well. But Yechezkel wrote the book of Eicha, a very sad, melancholy book, because he watched the destruction, he saw it happen. Was it Yirmiyahu?
So it was with the Chazon Atzamot HaYevashot, no?
No, that was Yeshayahu.
Okay.
Yes. So Yechezkel's a very unique Navi, because he was the only Navi to really receive Nebuah outside of Eretz Israel. And if you're awake on first day Shavuot of Tikkun El, you read the Haftorah of the first parak of Yechezkel, which according to my second Megilla, actually, it's in the third parak of the second Megilla. It speaks about Haftorahs you shouldn't read, and that's one of them, right? Because it's called the Maaseh Merkavah. It speaks about how they have this vision of the chariot of God. To understand in the physical, it's said in very physical terms because you can't physically comprehend it. But when God gives him the word to a Navi, he sees it in the way that he can understand. He gives it over the way that he understood it. So he puts physical dimensions onto this vision that he saw. So it's very difficult to understand.
This is also the time of the Mishnah, right?
Not yet, but it's the second.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're currently sitting in Babel, and this is where we had in Israel still, there was one leader called Gedaliah ben Achikam. He should have been the king. He was the king basically. And he basically placated, made sure that Israel was safe, let's say, in a way. And he got assassinated by a guy called Ishmael ben Netanya, and that was in the day after Rosh Hashanah. And that's what we have Som Gedaliah. Right? And that's where it comes from. Because that was the real nail in the coffin of the end of the Beit HaMikdash, the first Beit HaMikdash. Because there was no possible way to live without Gedaliah looking after us. So we're in Babel, and that's where we get people like Daniel. Daniel was a book in Tanakh, in Ketuvim, called Daniel, and he was a genius. He was sent as a kid to serve in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the Beit HaMikdash. He was a genius and a half. Could speak every language. He got nevuah as well. He was one thrown into the lion den and came out. And he was around in the times of the Megilla Esther, okay? Because Mordechai was exiled as well. Mordechai was an individual who sat on the Anshe Knesset Torah, which we'll get into now. Transition. And he was a really, really big rough. Everyone followed him, and they lived in the same time period. They were like Chabrutas even. And the whole story of Haman and Achashverosh happens in this time. In English, Xerxes, I think it is, Achashverosh in English, you can look it up and it fits within the history. Reading Sefer Daniel doesn't exactly. The years are very difficult to chap. It's towards the beginning of Masechet Megillah, the first parak. Very, very difficult to understand how the math works, but there's lots of books written about it.
Daniel is written in Aramaic. That's also difficult to understand because they were in Babylon. They were already in the exile.
Yeah.
Even though he could speak, and like it says that Mordechai could speak 72 different languages because the guys that actually sat on the court had to know all of the languages that they could judge. He Dafka chose to write his book in Aramaic rather than in Hebrew.
It's the only full book written in Aramaic. All other books might have a few Aramaic words. The Torah's got a few Aramaic words in it, which is interesting.
But he wanted to disclose his nationality.
Maybe.
They knew he was Jewish.
Really?
They knew he was Jewish, yeah. It's famous stories like he wouldn't eat the fruit. He wouldn't eat anything that he gave him seeds. I mean, that's their own idiots. So the pasuk says. So there was Ezra and Nehemiah who came along. Ezra being a Kohen, Nehemiah being again a servant of the king. Well, now it was Saul by now, and they basically pleaded to be able to return to Israel. And by the end of it, they got full permission to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. They got the structure to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash, they got everything under King Cyrus, King Choresh. Okay? King Choresh had a son called Darius I, who was also very, very like a real like political player. He gave the Jews permission to build and then stopped it midway through his reign, and until the Beit HaMikdash building stopped for a while, and then he passed away, and Ahasuerus came into power, that we know from the Purim story. His son, Darius II, allowed us to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash fully. That's where we finished. Ezra and Nehemiah, the story finishes there. So Ezra and Nehemiah look after Am Yisrael in Israel. Funnily enough, not primarily, it's not even most of the nation returns initially. Most of the nation stays in Babel. Israel was very unsafe, still like run by bandits and that kind of stuff. So most people stayed in Babel, and they did return, but nowhere near the magnitude of the first Beit HaMikdash. Very, very much smaller. And over time it got bigger. For example, when if you look at the rise and fall of the empires, King Herod comes in later on, and he rebuilt the Beit HaMikdash entirely. Makes this magnificent palace of God, and that's what we see today. The walls we see in Yerushalayim are 99, not the outer walls of the old city. The walls of Harabait are all his walls. You can there's proof. You can see where they cut the rocks, the way they laid the rocks. It's very interesting. We had a tour of Jerusalem about that part. But Ezra passes away in the year 313 BCE, and that's when we get the start of Judaism having to transition from a nation surrounded, like focusing on one temple, to a nation which can survive without a temple.
Sorry, I just want to check one thing. Saul, are you saying that the plan for the first temple was not the plan upon which the second temple was based?
So architecturally it was different. It was built differently. Because Solomon had endless supplies. It says that silver and gold were like dust in Solomon's Jerusalem. So he could build whatever he wanted. The dimensions of it were massive. Whereas Ezra and Nehemiah had some supplies here and there from the timber merchant of King Cyrus, and a little bit of gold and silver from here and there, but not enough to build an actual house of God. And that's what we know. They did look different.
Okay.
They look very different. The modern pictures we see of the temple with the little sparks in the top of the walls, that's the second one.
So the remnants we have, the Kotel remnants are from the second one.
Yes. Yeah. That's an external holding wall of Harabait. It isn't even part of the Beit HaMikdash itself.
So the actual magnitude is huge, much bigger of the first one.
Yeah. And there's also like the levels underground that it went to were also in the same proportions.
Yeah.
We're still discovering tunnels nowadays, which were used as storage chambers or literally anything.
If you've done those tunnel tours and you walk on the perspex, you can see like 2 or 3 levels underneath, underground that haven't even been. They started to excavate, but
just opened now a new space. It wasn't open before.
Sure.
I think it's about a month ago or whatever. And it's even more.
Yeah. So if you want to look up about this kind of stuff, there's a Rav called Rav Barnes Selavan. He was a tour of the Old City last year. He's like the archaeologist of the Old City kind of. He's unbelievable. You look at something and he'll tell you exactly what it is. He knows everything that's going on. But he writes extensively about it as well. Lots of videos about it. Very, very, very worthwhile watching. And so basically what happens is now we transition into a time of Rabbanim holding office. The Rabbanim were running the country. And if you look at Pirkei starts off, Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai, Moshe Sholas Kenim Levin, and then Moshe Sheikh Segura. Okay, so Moses to Joshua to the elders, the prophets to the Great Assembly. And then the Great Assembly were 120 men who basically canonized halacha for us. Okay, so they were the ones who kind of set out our Seder, our order of prayer. There was a guy called Hillel Azake who made the calendar, modern day calendar. They really set down what it means to live outside because they knew we were going into exile. That was the first exile. But we didn't realize the extent of how that was going to be. And therefore, Pirkei carries on. We get Shimon HaTzadik, the second Mishnah says Shimon HaTzadik HaMishach Knesset Gedolah. He was the last person of Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the last remnant. He was the last leader. And he was this magnificent human being. I say magnificent in the physical sense, like regal looking. And there's a very famous story in the Gemara where it's towards the end, I think it's my second Makot, it's towards the end, could be wrong, but Alexander the Great is on his rampage through the Middle East, taking over country after country. And he gets to Jerusalem, and the Jews hear he's coming. So they say to Shimon HaTzadik, can you please walk out? And he walks out to greet him. And Alexander the Great gets off his horse and comes out to him and kisses his feet.
Bows down to him.
Kisses Shimon HaTzadik's feet. And everyone was like, not knew what was going on. So they turned to Alexander and they said to him, what's that about? And he says, every even before I go to bed, before a war, before a battle, I have a dream. And this is the face I picture, and I'm going to be successful the next time. Every single time, I'm successful. And he left Jerusalem, he didn't touch it. Because of Shimon HaTzadik. He didn't touch it, so he has lived free. He was a tyrant. He took over land after land after land. But Israel, as a whole, he left pretty much.
That's why most people used to call their sons Alexander.
The Lubavitchers all called their sons Alexander after that. Yeah.
After the thing, right?
Yeah. Now Shimon HaTzadik passes away, and now kind of enters into real Roman rule, more Greek rule. Sorry, before Roman was Greeks. And
so let's just take a step. Where does the Mishnah fit into all of this?
Still before. Oh. Yeah, we're going to get to the Mishnah.
Just before Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah. No, I think yeah. We have like 200 still. 2 years to Rosh Hashanah. It's still better than that times. Okay. Now the Greeks are taking over Israel, and they're forbidding us to do the Torah, forbidding us to do these very public displays of Jewish action, and they did this test on the Jewish nation, where it's called the Septuagint, where they took 72 elders of the Zakanim, locked them up into individual rooms, and the king of the Greeks, who it was at that time, but walked into every room and said, "Here's the Torah, translated into Greek form." Again,
Plinius?
No.
It's actually Megilla as well.
Megilla as well. So we'll get
it's
right at the end of the first book. But basically, they took every single word and translated it the exact same. And even words which sometimes they have to change their wording so that when they translate into other languages, it sound heretical. For example, one is Bereshit bara Elokim. If you look at the words grammatically and translate it exactly, Bereshit, in the beginning, bara created God. The beginning created God, if you read it that way. Bereshit bara Elokim in grammatical Hebrew means God created in the beginning. That's how Hebrew flows. So they changed it to translate it in that way. Probably the funniest example of how sensitive they were to it. In Pashat Shmini and Pashat Re'eh, there's the word for a hair, or harax, little bunny things. In Hebrew it's an Arnevet. But the king's wife's name was Arnevet. So they changed it into Greek, into a different word, which meant the same thing, but a different nuance of it. So they wouldn't get in trouble from the kids.
They all did the same
thing. They all did the exact same thing. So it was a massive group. Yeah. Okay, a few years after this, we get Judah the Maccabee, and the story of Chanukah happened. Okay, the Greeks took over and kicked us out of the Beit HaMikdash. Judah Maccabee and his brothers came along and regained it. We get the whole story of Chanukah, where we managed to regain the temple and relight the menorah, and that was a real beautiful time of Judaism, because that's when we had real sovereignty that we really fought for and won for the first time since the conquest of Israel. Because before, we never actually been really challenged as a nation. The exiles from the Beit HaMikdash the first time, okay, they were rapid, we knew we were coming back. This time when the Greeks took over, we thought that was it. And Judah Maccabee came in, and his brothers, and they made a full-on state. They minted coins. That's like the sign of imperialism. They made their own full monarchy that came from them, which is interesting because they were Kohanim, which wasn't the dynasty. But they had a full row of kings. The problem was, after a few years, the kings started marrying Greeks, and the kings became very Hellenic. So you get like King Heraclius, who's Jewish, but he's also Greek. So it created a very interesting culture within Judaism. That's why Judaism is very, very against Hellenism, because it didn't come to destroy us physically, it came to destroy us spiritually. And that's when the Mishnah starts to come in. That's when Tanaim, the writers of the Mishnah start to really start flourishing in this time. And we'll skip this part over here because it takes a bit of a while to get all the way across. But basically, we transfer from Greek to Roman rule because the Greek Empire fell, the Romans took over them, and that's when it went downhill from there. The Mesa was destroyed in the year 69 Common Era. So Jesus went to the Mesa Midrash. He served his 12 apostles from Jews. Very interesting. Okay? They were all very from Jews, except for one, Paul. He was the only non-Jew, and he was the one responsible for spreading Christianity. The other ones were like separatists, they were cultists, like many other Jews were at the time, because the concept of Messianic Judaism was very, very popular, and the Romans hated it. So they killed anyone and everyone who showed an inkling of Messianism. So it created a very interesting dynamic in Jerusalem, because everyone was like kind of a bit sketchy, like who was your neighbor, who was your friend. Because they knew if they were you saying that you were a revolutionist or a person believing in the Messiah, they'd kill you immediately. And Jesus was just one of those people that came along. Now, it's interesting because you don't think of it this way, but Jesus lived in the same time as our Rabboni, like Hillel, the famous Tana from the Mishnah. Hillel lived in the same time as Jesus. They were the same time period. And they could have met each other. Or probably not, maybe like Hillel's students. After Jesus was born. But
So,
yeah.
in that regard, if 11 of those 12 apostles were Jews, and they all wrote the equivalent, I suppose, of history, but religious history, is there any reason we shouldn't be looking on what they wrote as almost prophetic?
Yeah, so the only difference is that first and foremost there was no prophecy anymore. Prophecy stopped by the first period of the second Beis Hamikdash. When we went into exile, that was the last inklings of prophecy. Ezra and Nehemiah were really the last people to actually receive prophecy, and even so they were still on a very low level. Nothing compares to like the miracles that Yechezkel and his contemporaries could see and do. The apostles, the problem with them was that they didn't necessarily write what we have of their work isn't necessarily their work, because they were very much Jews. They gave their korbanot, they served God, but they believed that there was a possibility that there was a certain way of looking at Judaism. Whereas Paul came across from Tarsus, not even from Israel at all, from an area like in the Iraq-Iran area, and Tashish, Lebanon, up north. He came into Israel and said, "No, you guys are misunderstanding what Jesus said. Jesus had died already. So you misunderstand what he said." And he wrote a whole new course of history by himself, not through the word of Jesus, but the word of Paul.
So the reason for my question is we heard from the other rabbi, the other Israeli, that in fact Christianity as a religion was created 450 odd years after the time of Jesus.
Yes.
Which means
Exactly.
at the time of the writings of those 11 apostles, they were writing as Jews.
I don't even think they wrote. That's not even they wrote the books. That's the truth. As in they could have like said a few things, and that got passed down from their son to their son, and eventually written down by maybe Paul or someone else later on.
Are we talking about the Old Testament?
New Testament. New Testament. Yeah. It's all very much disputed, and the whole. It's very easy to see it because there's a whole concept in Christianity that you can't comment on the Bible. There's no commentaries on the New Testament. It's forbidden according to the church.
Oh, really?
Yeah. If you look at it, there's no Rashi, there's no nothing. They don't have any commentaries on it, and it's because it's entirely forbidden. So we move into this period of time where we had the Chazal, the rabbis, which we're going to now, realizing that this is do or die. If we don't set out what Judaism is to be now, there will be no more Judaism afterwards. If we don't decide on what the halacha should follow to live in Jewish life outside of Israel and Beis Hamikdash, there will be no Jews. We'll assimilate to a group. And therefore, we have to kind of write our own code of law. That would be passed down from generation to generation without any changes. The same words, the same thing we pass on every single time. And that's where we get the Mishnah from. Okay? The Mishnah started to be written during the times of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay? And towards the end of the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. That's when time still lived. Rabbi Akiva speaks about how he lived in the times of the Beit HaMikdash and he witnessed the destruction, the last piece of Gemara in Masechet Makot, speaks about Rabbi Akiva and his contemporaries walking at the ruins of the temple. And
They see the frogs. Remember that story?
Yeah.
So they saw frogs walking out of the
Now,
temple,
probably coming up, yeah.
and they were all crying. Rabbi Akiva was laughing. And they said to him, "Why are you laughing?" And he said, "Well, why are you crying?" And they said, "Because there's a fox coming out." So they said to him, "Why are you laughing?" So he said, "Because the Torah specifically says that there will be foxes walking out of the temple." So they said, "And if that has come true now, then the redemption is also going to come true because it's all part of the same word of God."
Sure.
And they say,
It's the last 2 words of the sentence.
"You've
So-
consoled us, and Akiva, you've consoled us." That's what-
Yeah. So we enter into this time here called Chazal, okay, which stands for Chachmenu, our sages, Zichronim Levracham, and their memory be a blessing. Just put together as Chazal. Now the period of Chazal ranged from the year 200 years before Yoshka to 600 years after. Okay, very long period of time. Now the booklet, the timeline in the booklet finishes here, and this is what I wrote down afterwards. And feel free to read it, criticize it, edit it. I'm very happy with that because I did it long ago and haven't looked at it since. But we have different periods in the period of Chazal, which each have a different role because they each have a different necessity in the time. So from the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash until basically the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, maybe like mid era of second Beit HaMikdash, we have an era called the Sofrim, the scribes. These are the rabbis who started writing down halacha slowly. Okay, so guys like Mordechai, Shimon HaTzadik, those are the rabbis, and Tigris Isocho. Those are the rabbis who were the primary people who carried the concept of halacha and moving forward halacha into like more like visionary states of saying we know we're going to be exiled, so we might as well start now. Those are the guys who started, and they were followed by a period where it's a very short period of time called the Zugot. If you look at Pirkei Avos in the first period, it always says X and X receive the Torah from ones above them, and then X and X receive from above them, and it gets passed down to pairs. Now these Zugot were the one acted as the head of Judaic life, and the other one was the municipal head. So you had an Av Beit Din, the one who was the head of the Beit Din, and the other one was the Rosh Hashanah basically, and they worked in tandem. Both Talmidei Chachamim, geniuses, and they wrote down halacha for us. Now, during that time still, it was all oral, and there was a prohibition still to write down this word. So it was passed down from father to son, and there was basically people's jobs. You were hired, your job profession, you were called a Tana. Your job, and it existed in the Gemara too. Your job was to memorize all of the Mishnayot, all of the sayings from a certain book. So, for example, Masechet Brachot. There was one guy whose job was to remember every single Mishnah, Braita and Tosefta, which we'll discuss now, in Brachot, as well as all the Midrashim ones. Okay? And he would memorize them all. He'd be a professional in it. That was his job. Was this big. And that's how it got passed down from generation to generation. You know, the master would teach the students, and that's how it got passed down. But eventually, like everything, the information became too much. And that's when Rabbi Nasi came along and said, you know what, people are forgetting this. They actually start writing it down. And within the like you picture it as a massive room, and you picture it with sticky notes all over the walls. These ways are remembered. And the entire room is covered with sticky notes. And Rabbi Nasi walks into the room and he takes a sticky note and it says, you have to eat the Korban Pesach on the 14th of Pesach, on the 14th of Nisan. He goes, there's a sticky note over there about that. And he starts collecting all of them together. And eventually got a pile of sticky notes, all on the same concept. He refines them to find the primary ones, compiles them into a book, and calls it Mishnah Pesachim. Now they've got leftover sticky notes, and those become the additionals. Okay, so you got Braitot and Tosefta. Tosefta means additional. Braita means add-ons. So it's all the stuff which is important, but wasn't important enough for us to use every single day. And then there was books of them, which have been lost over time, but the Gemara records many of them, if not majority of them. We still do have a very vast amount in them, but nowhere near what was the sheer volume of it. And eventually he managed to finish off his masterpiece of 63 different books. In his time it was 60, and then we expanded to 63 by cutting one of the books into 3. But 60 books spanning into 6 different topics, okay, which is Zmanim, times, so it's all the times which you started with, Brachot, and then it goes into all the farming stuff, so Paya, sentence Zmanim, impossible to understand. Impossible to understand.
I'm getting chills.
I don't think anything was clever. We tried it. Okay? So we got Zmanim, okay, speaks about the times of the year and that kind of stuff. Moed, which speaks about festivals and Shabbos and all that kind of stuff. Then it goes Nashim, which speaks about the laws of women and marriage, divorce, all that kind of stuff. Zmanim, Moed, Nashim, Nezikin. Okay, Nezikin is damages. So all the monetary laws. So you got all the three Baba Kamala, Baba Tzia, and Baba Batra, as well as Makot and Sanhedrin Makot, you're right, sorry. That's all monetary laws. If you do X, what's the consequence? How you be punished? How you be punished in basically. Then you got Nezik and Kodshim, which speaks about all the Korbanot, all the service, and then Taharot, which deals with purity and impurity. And each of them has got X amount of books, roughly 10 or so, some more, some less, all equals to 63. And that's the Mishnah for us. Now there's a short time period between the Mishnah and what we call the Gemara, where basically people were learning the Mishnah. Okay? It was written down already for them, they had it, and there was the main Torah learning area, you can read in the book, but there was spread out in Israel, one of them being Yavne, okay, one of them being Bnei Brak, not the modern Bnei Brak, but good, like next door basically. There's the ancient Bnei Brak there, you can still go see the ruins. Currently there's a yeshiva called Yeshiva Kerem Yavne, and the reason why it's called that is because in the Gemara, it says how they used to sit, it's in Yavne, was in that a few years ago, they used to sit in rows, like a vineyard. So Kerem is a vineyard, Yavne, in Yavne. And the reason that happened is because basically the Roman king came to Jerusalem and said, I'm going to destroy it. And Yochanan, a Kohen, walked out to the king and said, Tell me Yavne v'chochmeh. Give me Yavne and her scholars. He said, let me move the primary scholars of Judaism to Yavne, instead of them being in Jerusalem. And the king would read, and the main Torah center of Israel became Yavne and Lod, which is close to Jerusalem. And then as time went on later, the Tzara'im moved up north. So you can go up north now, go to Tiberias, all those areas up there, and you can see the ruins of their shuls. You can be davening mincha in the shul of tonight. It's not really a shul anymore, but it's a little, some bricks on a hill. Yeah. But that became the primary. You can go visit their graves. The graves are all up in the north there. And the beautiful thing about the Tanaim is that they weren't just sitting and learning the whole day. They had jobs. They were blacksmiths. There was one called Nafcha. Nafcha is a blacksmith. There were wood choppers, water drawers, sandal makers. Rabbi Yochanan a sandal. He made sandals. They had jobs, and in their spare time they were top. So like it just shows how that's we live life like that. We have jobs, but we learn to at the same time.
But you think about these people, the impact that they create, by working and studying, and then you got the Chachamim today.
Yeah.
These guys are something genius.
So they wrote
There was one guy, when he used to learn, and a bird would fly over his head, it would burn, literally.
Their connection.
Yeah.
Literally would burn. They had like roast chicken from like
Yeah. So Rabbi Yochanan bar Yochai, he was a Tana. Him and when he killed all the Romans, they ran away, they didn't camp for 20 years. And they walked out. And they were so holy with their eyes, were just singeing everything they were seeing. Very interesting Gemara. A lot to learn, they've got a beautiful source from Yeshiva. But like very, very fundamental like learning style. We can't even fathom the knowledge they had. Now they didn't write in one Hebrew, it's called Lashon Mishnah, Lashon Chazal, or Lashon Chachamim, okay? Whereas Hebrew is like evolved with some. Torah is in Lashon HaKodesh, that's Torah Hebrew, and moves into Lashon Chachamim, which is Mishnah Hebrew, into Aramaic and into modern Hebrew, kind of all like, and all blends, all the same root words, just different, pretty much like the punctuation difference, that's it. And there were 5 main generations of Tanai, of course, many within those, like 220 we know of. And they were the main ones who ran the generations, they were like the leaders. And it's all in the document for you guys to read it. Really, really interesting stuff. It was Yishmael ben Elisha, which burn birds in his head. Yeah, so towards the end of the Mishnah period, there was like a small break where there was a kind of like transition period between Mishnah and Gemara, where Rabbi Yochanan Nasi had finished off the Mishnah. He had finished it and like said it's done, this is it, we don't add any more. But there were still a few rabbis who were around who were still considered Tanaim, but now they're moving into a new time period because the Mishnah was done. One of them, for example, is a rabbi called Rav. Okay? Rav lived, he was like the transition rabbi. He's known as that, it's called Rabbi Tanapali. He's the only one who can argue onto 9. Because you basically can't, from the same level, you can argue on the same level. You can't argue a level up. You can argue down because you're higher up, but you can't argue upwards because they're closer to Matan Torah, first of all. In a concept called Yeridas Dorot, that every generation we go down a step. We enter into this period of Amorai, where Shmuel, Rabbi Shmuel, I think that's later. Yeah, Shmuel was younger than Rabbi. So we move into this period where we have, because we're in exile, the Jews are more primarily living in Babylonia than in Israel. And we had these major academies basically opening up. We have a few scattered amongst it. So we have 3 primary academies in Babel, called Surah, Naharda, and Pumbedita, the 3 main yeshivas. They're named after the cities, but they were the main ones. Surah and Naharda were known as the primary, and Pumbedita was like the overflow, basically. No, Surah and Pumbedita were the primary, sorry, no, that was the overflow, sorry. And basically, the leaders of the generation were the 2 Rosh Yeshiva, the one of Surah and the one of Pumbedita. Okay? So for example, Rav and Shmuel. Okay? They're like the boxing partners in the Gemara. If Rav says something, Shmuel will always argue. Black and white, always. Okay? For example, Abai and Rav. If Abai says something, Rav will argue. Rav says something, Abai will argue back. And that's because they're just different views in life. They lived in different towns, they ran different cities, they had different outlook in life entirely. And that's what the Gemara is so against. Because if you look at the Yerushalmi, there wasn't this kind of back and forth. There's one Rabbi knows it. So if you learn Yerushalmi, first of all, it's very difficult because the Hebrew itself is weird. Because it's transitioning from Lashon Chacham, which is like Aramaic, and it just doesn't make any sense. You try to read it and you don't know what's flying. But it's concise. It's got question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. No arguments, nothing. Why? Because there's no one to argue with. It was obvious for them. Okay? And more than that, there's less editing. Because of this infrastructure, the editing of it is far more like rudimentary. It's not like so advanced like the Talmud Bavli is. So it's a lot more difficult to learn because you get pieces in which there's different editions. If your town had a set of shas, it doesn't mean that a few towns out the same one.
Yeah, we spoke about like the different.
Yeah, and we'll get onto that in a few minutes. So Yerushalmi is very difficult. There's so many different contradictory wordings. The halacha is always the same, but the wording of it, and that's the beauty of it. We're so careful about how to give the right credit to the person who said it, that we don't mess up the wording. So you can buy a set of Yerushalmi with all the different possible Girsal, all the different possible language that are used, and it's just this thick for one book. Whereas in Al-Gemaras, if you look, you'll see the star and look on the side and see there's one other option. Or you'll see a star at the bottom, there's 2 other options from the Bach. For example, it was a gun, we haven't seen this now. But generally speaking, in a very set format. Because it went through a lot of generations, there were like 8 generations of Amoraim who wrote down things. They commented, they argued, they fought. And they also had these times. These guys would stand in the shul and they would tell you what it is. So, let's say for example, the Rav was giving these shir klali, he was standing up in front giving this big shir of a week. And he says, I need to find a Mishnah that speaks about Paya. And you go, Paya man, and Paya man walks in the back and he goes, I need a Mishnah speaking about this dimension of a Paya field. And the Paya man would list every single Mishnah you could think about Paya fields. They connected to that. It's fantastic, and you can't get in the shir. And the guys in the front row were the prominent scholars, and they sucked everything in. And there's famous stories where they argued of how do we understand Rav? What was the shir actually about? And how you'll have two Talmidim of the same Rav arguing with each other. Why? Because they said that shir klali, and the one who's shofing on was awake, and the one who was wrong. It happens. They literally said that. He was asleep in the shir, didn't understand it properly. So they were human too. But we basically end up towards the end of the Gemara period with again a bigger room full of sticky notes, and there was so much written about it that we couldn't include because if we did, there would just be vast amount that just would be impossible to learn. And along came these 2 rabbis called Ravina and Rabashi. Ravina also, there was Ravina the third. His grandfather was Yoshiva, his father was Yoshiva, he was the third one, and his contemporary Rabashi. And the 2 of them sat together and said, look, this is getting too big, let's canonize it again. So they combined, and they took the sticky notes, compiled it into a book, and came up with these big masechta that we have nowadays. Now, they didn't comment anything on Paya, on those books, because it made no sense to. Because no one was living in Israel, no one was confined. Exactly. They weren't confined, but the most very solid books within knowledge. Whereas Yerushalmi has got full books on Seder's money, because they lived in Israel. Israel, whatever. Okay? They got full books written, Gemaras on these books because the books were topical to them. But for people living in exile, it wasn't topical at all. And then with a few Masechtot, if you look at Masechtot Rice, which has got a bit of Gemara, but not much, because it was topical, but not topical enough. So you see the difference in like thought process of why am I writing this book? You know, if they're living in Israel, they need the halakha, they need to be able to live in the land and keep Shemitah year and keep Paya and keep all these important halachas. But in Babel, there was nothing that existed like that. So you don't even focus on it. What's going to keep our people Jewish? This is the halakha. What's the bracha you make on a nap? Okay? When do we keep Pesach? When do we keep Shavuot? That's the halakha we need.
How do you keep Shabbat?
How do you keep Shabbat? How do you marital relations? How do you get married? How do you get divorced? All that kind of stuff needs to be discussed because that was topical for us. And that's what they kind of set out to do and define us properly. And you can, there's lots, dynasties of rabbis, fathers, rabbis, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and you can list them all the way back up. And it's amazing because you can look, there's books where we'll get to the Geonim now, where Rabbanim sat down and wrote down the lineage and they linked it all the way back up to Avraham Avinu. They could link every single person all the way up, without fail. And we end up also toward the end of it. It's very interesting. It's not more of a modern concept, but it's much more research now. There was a person who survived the Holocaust, whose name, Rav Halevi or something like that. Literally, he studied at Tel Aviv University for years afterwards. But he's a primary proponent of this. This concept called the Stamim, who were these rabbis who lived toward the end, contemporaries of Rabbeinu Rashi, but they were the editors of the Gemara, but lived in different cities. So they wrote differently in different styles of language. He got lots of writing because you can read. Stylistically, this Gemara is written differently, this Gemara is written differently. Very interesting idea. But the most important thing to realize when you're reading a Gemara is that you're not reading something that was written in a conversation at a table. You're jumping back and forth thousands of years, hundreds of years every single time you turn a page. Because you start at the Mishnah, which is 400, 500, 600 years before. And you move forward into the Gemara, which starts off with Rabbeinu and Rav Ashi have an argument, and jumps back to Rav and Shmuel, who were 400 years before them, and then goes back to a Abai who sat in the middle. So as you turn a page, you're actually jumping through Jewish history when you read the argument. Because the argument wasn't just a single debate around the table, it was an argument developed over hundreds of years and refined over hundreds of years. And so the most beautiful part of it is that you're getting the pillars. When you're reading it, you're getting what the conversation boiled down to, what the most important parts of it. You don't have to read all the rubbish that came along with it. You get the refined part of it, which for us isn't refined, because there's so much of it. But the fundamentals of how to understand it is what we get. And that's the final product. Moving to a very short period after that called the Sforai, which according to a lot of people wasn't even a period. They basically were the ones who just fixed the grammar mistakes. They were like the people who made sure the Gemara was presentable, it was neat, it looked right, but not in the way we have it. All it was just pages and pages and pages and pages. The book like this, no commentaries, nothing. Okay, and we'll get on to how it looks like today. It's way later on though. Rab David Bas Halili, that was his name. Sorry, this is not the Holocaust, that was it. But we move into the last part of, this is the last part of Chazal. Esforan, the people after the Amoraim were the last part of Chazal themselves. Because that's when halakha itself was canonized. That's when all halakha that would ever be written was written, and now all the books written on that are just commentaries and refinements of that. Taking out the argument, the conclusion, and writing it out for us to understand. That was the job of the Olim, and we'll see that later on. We show them in a photo. So all halakha that needed to be said was done, and therefore we could live as a nation and function as a nation, keeping halakha. And the beauty is that now because all halakha is written down, Jews started to spread around the world. Beforehand, primarily, they lived in Israel and they lived in Babel. But now the times they go on in, people start to spread around the world. And that's how you get this concept called shutim, which means shaylas or teshulas. That's an acronym for shaylas or teshulas, where they took all questions they got asked from around the world, and instead of writing an answer yes, no, they wrote a book and gave the books to the community. And that's how we have this whole Jewish history thing. There was a Rab called Rav Shura Gaon, and answer a question, I think it's from Tripoli, if I'm not mistaken. He wrote a full history of Am Yisrael from the Beit HaMikdash to point. Full history. And that's why we have this beautiful period, and we know it's true because he can link himself back to his father, his father, grandfather, went all the way back to Avraham Avinu. He's got this perfect link, both through Torah and both through dynasty, just blood itself. So a really, really beautiful idea. But these Gaonim were, again, geniuses. The name Gaon means genius. And their job was basically to make sure the Jews around the world knew what was going on. So, twice a year they would give them a color, but everyone for 1 month would come to their yeshivas and they'd learn for a month one specific concept. So, for this month, they would be learning the concept of Shabbos. everyone is learning Shabbos. The whole of the people are learning Shabbos, and they said that they don't do Shabbos now. Because they don't go to Yachakara, all those people did. And then the next Yachakara, they'll learn the laws of marriage. Fantastic, everyone knows. And then the laws of marriage. So halacha became decentralized in the times of the Goyim. And that's how we end up with having Jews coming from all over the world. That's how we get Ashkenazi versus because this is when it started. When it actually started to really split is in the times of Rishonim. A few, maybe hundreds after the end of the last Gaon, who was Rav Sa'adja Gaon. Okay, again, in this time, Rav Chayyim wrote the Sidur that we have on modern Sidur. Again, a few changes here and there, but he wrote the Vanezo on modern Sidur. A whole lot of other shortim questions and answers, thousands of them. Rav Amital of the Gush he knew them all by heart. His big thing with Yokes and Shut. So he knew Shut Balpe. And we have like really like a few fundamental ones which you know about, not a lot of them, but you know about a few of them. The term Gaon was given to Rosh Hashiva. That was his title. It wasn't called Rosh Hashiva XYZ, it was called Rab Achai Gaon, Rab Shrina Gaon. That was Rab Chai Gaon. And that was their title. That's where this book ends, that's where Chazal ends. But thereafter, we get the period of the Rishonim and Achronim. Now the Rishonim, so Rashi comes in now. So basically, the Gemara now ends up as a piece of work, okay? And people start writing commentaries on it. The problem is there's lots of commentaries, and no one knows really what's flying. Now, we have the times of the Rishonim, okay, which is Rashi, Rambam, Tosfot, all of them. That's the times of the Rishonim. They come along and they start commenting. And what their job was to take this very convoluted argument and boil it down into simple halacha. So, Yosef Karo, for example, took it and wrote the Shulchan Aruch, the first code of halacha. The Rambam came before him, took it into 14 books called the Chazaka, which we learn as the Mishnah Torah. Again, they're based as well. They all base their works on each other. And if there was a rabbi before you, you could look at his work and you could edit it and combine it with other rabbis who would disagree. Why they disagree? Because they have different traditions in different cities. Because Ashkenaz and Sfaradi was not a thing. So, for example, Rashi was a Sfaradi, the Rambam was a Sfaradi, but you got someone called the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isiris, who was an Ashkenazi, and he wrote Ashkenazi halacha. You get the Tur, the Rosh, or Ashkenazi halacha. So that's how halacha kind of split. Now, there was a woman and her two sons living in Megilla, in Lithuania, and they said this style doesn't work, the format doesn't work, and they took upon themselves to make the format we have today. And that's what if you look at any Gemara now.
So this is on the Gaon.
No, so yeah, so from Isaiah 7, he came a bit later.
No,
He was an Achron.
Okay.
If you look in this, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
This is the. You look in these, you will see in the front. Sorry. This is called a Vilna edition Gemara because it's the way it's set out. We'll have in the front. Where is that? But a classic Vilna Daf will have Tosfot on the outside. Tosfot was Rashi's grandchildren.
Okay.
So the main one was Rav Tam, sorry. He was the primary one, and Rashi on the inside. Okay, the reason why Rashi is on the inside because Rashi was the primary one. Tosfot
They're
was
only
the
English.
question.
There's no English.
So the middle part here is Aramaic. This part over here is more Lashon Chacham, a little bit later on, and this part is also because it's a little bit later. And why they wrote Rashi on the inside is because if the word started eating away at the pages, you didn't want to lose the primary commentary.
Yes.
You'd rather use the outside commentary. Because Tosfot asks big questions and gives really hectic answers. To understand the Tosfot is amazing. You have to sit and learn for hours. Whereas Rashi says, what does this word mean? It says, what's the meaning of this? Quick answer for 5-year-olds. That was his point. Rashi said, I want to write for 5-year-olds. So to really understand the Gemara, we need a Rashi. And you open up the back of the Gemara, and you get people like the Marsha, the Rosh, the Tur, the Rish, the Rashash. Okay? You get all these different answers, all these different commentaries on it. We're living at the same time as Rashi, but we're also writing more like extended commentaries, beautiful questions, and like real thought-provoking concepts. That made it very difficult to learn Gemara by itself. Because once you start learning it, you have to understand what's going on. And that's where the whole concept of iyum, where you don't just read the pages on the book, but look at the commentaries that came about. And after Rishonim came the period of Achronim, who again, it wasn't like anything really different, but the difference was the level of understanding. The difference became that they weren't really writing their own new chidushim, their new novelties. They were commenting on the works of the Rishonim, who were also condensing the works of the Gemara. So in a sense, they were just condensing everything into more and more concise books. Problem is, there's so many of them, and in fact, they're just expanding to it at the same time. Because more books are being written to try and make everything smaller. So there's just more books came about. And that's why Torah is so big. You could never physically learn all Torah. Because it's just
it's such a miracle if you think about it. They had to Torah Balpeh.
Yeah.
I mean, you're looking at only the Tosafot now, and I mean, obviously, when at the beginning there was not a Tosafot, it was just one version.
Yeah.
But like,
Yeah.
Lot to learn, huh?
Yeah.
But I mean, how they managed to keep it going and lose
so
everything.
like you get Prime Yachronim, my laptop's got this on it. I didn't print it because it wasn't done properly. But Prime Yachronim includes the Vilna Gaon, for example, it was an Achron. Kiva Ega, yes. And then the second was an Achron. Late Achron, very late Achron, very late Achron, but yeah.
We did the Rambam 50.
Rambam was a Rishon. Yes. He
You
can
know,
be.
with Rash.
So he was
He was 7 times.
yeah, Stefan a little bit earlier than Rash. A little bit earlier than Rash. But yeah. Then they lived in the same area. The Rambam lived in Egypt and in Spain, whereas Rashi was in France. And the beautiful thing is that it was amazing in Cairo, ancient Cairo, Fastet, which is the old name for Cairo. There was a shul, and in the shul, like had been used, but no one actually used it properly. An archaeologist came into the shul to look at it, and there was a room called the Geniza, which is a Shemus, so they keep all the stuff that was meant to be buried. And this room had been sealed, the door was never unlocked, and there was a little slit on the top. Like upstairs, you go upstairs, and a little hole in the floor, and you drop your stuff. And this archaeologist came in, British guy, and he he opened it up, and he found pieces of paper that were dating back thousands of years. He found the Rambam's handwriting. It's amazing because you sit and you read, you open up a Mishnah Torah. Over here, for example, and you read how at the beginning of every halakha that the Rambam gives, he writes a little introduction about what the main mitzvahs are, and you see in this copy how the Rambam writes something and scratches it out and replaces the words to make it sound clearer. Wrong one.
So when you see no way,
So you can actually see the Rambam's thought process in writing halachas as you hold this piece of paper in front of you. And that's how, like, that's again proving it's true. There's copies in there, handwritten by Rabbi Zakara of the Shulchan Aruch. Like handwritten copies in their own handwriting. There's even pages from the Geniza of kindergarten work. Kids going to write the Aleph Beit and doodles the kids are writing.
About Beryl One talks about it.
Yeah. So there's even Rambam's got some doodles in his book. Like in his own handwriting. And they can tell us Arabic, they can date the ink, and they can date the style of the handwriting. And it's all now kept in England. It's in Cambridge or Oxford, one of the two. But we then move into more later Rabbonim, like the Achrei Achron. And before there were yeshivas. There were places you could go learn. There was no real set curriculum for yeshiva. There was no real like yeshiva how we know today. Until the Panovich yeshiva came along, and under Rav Soloveitchik and more than Tziv than anyone else, he kind of set out how to learn Be'iyun by taking all the sources and combining them into one concise shiur. But again, taking all the poster notes around that comment on the Gemara and building together an idea of how the Gemara works. So, for example, when you're learning a piece of Gemara, you can open up the Gemara, you can read it, and you can go to the back, and you can say, well, what do they say? And then you look at another one, another Rishon or another Achron, and what do they say? But why do they differ? What are they arguing on? And that's not considered Iyun. Why are they arguing? What are they arguing? What's the main point of the argument? And that's what we build Torah learn. That's what you're learning in yeshivas nowadays. And you take pieces of Gemara, pieces of Mishnah, pieces of Torah, and you build them together to try and understand a holistic view of Torah itself. And we enter now, currently we play the Achrei Achronim, the post Achronim basically, where we have the leaders of the Jewish nation called Achrei Achronim. They come after the Achronim because they're still writing halacha for us. They're still advancing Torah every single day.
I was going to ask the question, are there guys that can do that?
Torah is being advanced every single day. For example, there's a Rav called Rav Osher Voss. He's currently the preeminent Rav on medical ethics and halacha. Unbelievable stuff. He's got a series of books called Minchad Asher. His stuff is amazing. South Africa, 2 years back. 3 years back, right before COVID. But an amazing Rav. A genius. And his books are revolutionary. They change the way you can learn Torah entirely. It's about modern times. So Torah is always evolving, Torah is always changing. So you're never going to learn all of it. You got to start somewhere. And that's when you sit down and open up the Gemara and say, well, what did Chazal say initially that caused us to have to learn more and understand more? Yeah. That's
6,000 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's amazing.
Very confident.